What if a single decision could change everything? Sarah Whitman noticed a man in a hoodie, sitting too long in the waiting area. She called the police, only to realize later that the man she'd called on owned the bank. Had she just made the biggest mistake of her career? Join us at H2 Black Thread as we uncover a story of love, betrayal, and redemption. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos. Because the truth deserves to be told. Let's begin. The quiet hum of Brookfield Bank and Trust pulsed steadily through the air, keyboards clicking, the faint chime of the automatic door, printers churning out receipts, and the gentle murmur of conversations between tellers and customers. It was the rhythm of routine, the sound of a well-oiled machine. At her desk, Sarah Whitman barely noticed the passage of time. Her fingers moved swiftly across a stack of loan applications, each one a sea of numbers, credit scores, and approval thresholds. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through a document. Another rejected loan. She sighed, jotting down a note. The applicant had a borderline credit score, risky, but not impossible. She was considering whether to push it through for further review when the front door swung open. The faintest breeze stirred the papers on her desk as the new arrival stepped inside. It was the kind of entrance she wouldn't have normally paid attention to, except something about it pulled at the edges of her focus. The man was black, in his late 40s, tall and well-built but not imposing. His clothes were plain, a dark hoodie, fitted jeans, and a pair of sneakers that looked comfortable but well-worn. There was nothing inherently unusual about him, but Sarah's eyes lingered a beat longer than they should have. He didn't approach the counter like most customers did. Instead, he glanced around the room, scanned the layout, then strode casually toward the waiting area without making eye contact with anyone. He sat down, pulled out his phone, and began scrolling. Sarah turned back to her loan applications, but a tiny seed of curiosity had already planted itself in her mind. Behind the counter, Eric Turner, the assistant branch manager, was handling a customer with an overdraft issue. His easygoing voice drifted through the space as he explained the bank's policy, gesturing toward the screen. Two tellers, Anna and Michael, were handling transactions. Anna with a young woman depositing a check, Michael helping an elderly couple withdraw cash. The security guard, Tom Davis, stood near the entrance, his arms crossed as he surveyed the room with the trained patience of someone who had worked this job for years. Everything was business as usual, except Sarah found herself glancing back at the waiting area. At first, she had dismissed the man entirely. Customers sometimes waited, some had appointments with loan officers. Others were waiting for their partners to finish banking. But as 15 minutes passed, he remained seated. Sarah's pen tapped absently against her desk. Something about the way he sat felt off, or maybe it was just that he was too at ease. Most people in a bank had a sense of purpose. They came in, got their business done, and left. This man wasn't anxious. He wasn't glancing at the teller line like someone waiting for their turn. He wasn't shifting in his seat impatiently like a spouse waiting on a partner. He just sat there. She watched as he glanced at his phone, then at the clock, then back at his phone. A tiny voice in the back of her mind whispered, "He's waiting for something, or someone." She turned to Eric, lowering her voice. "You know that guy?" Eric followed her gaze, then shrugged. "Nope, maybe he's waiting for someone." Sarah frowned slightly. "Maybe." But something still didn't feel right. Her fingers tightened around her pen as she tried to focus on her work. Another 5 minutes passed. She looked up again. Still there. Sarah had been in banking for 20 years. She had seen every type of customer walk through those doors, business owners in suits, retirees counting out bills, young couples nervously applying for their first loans, and she had learned to trust her gut. Bank security training taught them to identify red flags. customers who loitered for extended periods, individuals who scanned the room too much but didn't approach the counter, unfamiliar faces who didn't fit the bank's usual clientele. None of these were explicit reasons for concern, but together, they made her uneasy. She turned back to Eric. "Keep an eye on him." Eric gave her a sideways glance but nodded. "You think he's—" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, but she wasn't willing to take chances. Sarah was about to return to her paperwork when the door chimed again. An older white couple entered. The woman's gaze fell immediately on the man in the hoodie. It was a flicker of hesitation, a tightening of her grip on her purse as she subtly nudged closer to her husband. Sarah caught it. She's uneasy, too. She didn't question why the woman's reaction felt like validation. Instead, it reinforced the discomfort already simmering inside her, and with each passing minute, that unease turned into something more pressing. Her mind flashed back to a security bulletin from corporate last week. A memo had warned branch managers about a series of bank fraud attempts across the city, scammers posing as loitering customers, watching teller movements, memorizing passcodes, or timing transactions. She didn't know if this man fit that pattern, but wasn't it better to be safe than sorry? Her pulse quickened. "If he doesn't move in the next 5 minutes, let me know." Eric shifted uncomfortably. "You sure about this?" His expression seemed to say. Sarah wasn't sure, but she needed to be cautious. She stole one last glance at the waiting area. The man looked up just then, his gaze flickering toward her. His face remained unreadable. But for the first time, Sarah felt like he had been aware of her, watching him all along. Her stomach tightened. Her fingers found the phone, and the decision was made. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dialed the non-emergency police line. "Yes, this is Sarah Whitman from Brookfield Bank. We have a suspicious individual in our lobby. He's been here for over 20 minutes without approaching the counter. Can you send someone to check it out?" She kept her voice low. Across the room, the man glanced up once more. Their eyes met. And for the briefest moment, something unspoken passed between them. But before Sarah could second-guess her decision, the dispatcher responded. "Units are on their way," she exhaled, certain she had done the right thing. But in the next hour, she would learn just how wrong she had been. The phone receiver felt cool in Sarah Whitman's hand as she pressed it against her ear, waiting for a dispatcher to pick up. Her heart beat steadily, but there was a slight tremor in her fingers, barely noticeable. She wasn't nervous, at least that's what she told herself. She was simply doing her job. 911, what's your emergency?" Sarah hesitated for the briefest moment before she responded. "This is Sarah Whitman from Brookfield Bank. We have a suspicious individual in our lobby. He's been here for over 20 minutes without approaching the counter. I'm not sure what he's waiting for." There, she had said it, just the facts, nothing exaggerated, nothing misleading. "Can you describe the individual?" the dispatcher asked. Sarah glanced at the waiting area again. The man was still there, calm, composed, scrolling through his phone. He looked completely at ease, almost too at ease. "Black male, late 40s, medium build," she said. "He's wearing a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. He hasn't interacted with any of the tellers, hasn't approached the counter, just sitting there." "Has he done anything threatening?" Sarah hesitated. "No, he hadn't." "No," she admitted, "but he's been here for over 20 minutes without making a transaction. I just want to be cautious." "Understood. Officers are on their way." As she hung up the phone, a cold, lingering feeling settled in her stomach. Had she overreacted? Sarah wasn't a fearful person. She prided herself on being rational, level-headed, and fair. But something about this situation felt different. She turned back to her paperwork, trying to shake off the unease. But the bank, once filled with the usual murmur of customers, now seemed too quiet. And it wasn't just her. She noticed how the older couple who had entered earlier kept their distance from the waiting area. She caught how Michael, the teller closest to the man, kept glancing over, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Even Eric, who had initially dismissed her concerns, seemed less certain now. Sarah took these reactions as subtle confirmations. If others were also uneasy, then maybe her instincts were right after all. She turned to Eric. "Police are on their way." Eric frowned. "You actually called them?" "I'd rather be safe than sorry." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Sarah, come on, the guy hasn't done anything." "Not yet," she countered. "We both know scammers work in teams. He could be watching our tellers, memorizing their keystrokes, waiting for a distraction." Eric didn't argue, but his silence spoke volumes. Sarah turned back to her desk. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? As she forced herself to review loan applications, Sarah's mind drifted back to an incident 5 years ago, one that had stayed with her. A man had walked into the bank, well-dressed, briefcase in hand, charming and polite. He had flashed a convincing ID, filled out paperwork effortlessly, and applied for a business loan. Only weeks later, when the application was flagged for fraud, did they realize his entire identity had been fabricated. By then, he was long gone, and so was the bank's money. Sarah had been humiliated. She had missed the signs, trusted too easily. That mistake had cost the bank thousands of dollars. Since then, she had taught herself to be more observant, more cautious. That was all she was doing now, being cautious. A week ago, a corporate security memo had circulated through all branches. It had detailed a new scam tactic: loitering fraudsters, individuals who lingered in banks for extended periods, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. According to the memo, these scammers often worked in pairs. One would distract the tellers while the other memorized security codes or stole personal information. Sarah had read the memo twice. And now this man, alone, sitting quietly, waiting, fit the profile too well. Was it paranoia? Maybe. But she couldn't afford another mistake. She tried to think of other reasons he might be sitting there for so long. Maybe he had an appointment with a loan officer. No, all scheduled clients had already checked in. Maybe he was waiting for someone else to finish banking. Then why wasn't he glancing around for them? Maybe he just liked to sit and use his phone. Who did that in a bank for this long? None of these explanations felt convincing enough, so she stuck with her first conclusion. The air in the bank felt thicker now, like a tension had settled over the space, even if most people hadn't noticed it yet. Sarah watched the man glance at his phone, then at the clock, then back at his phone again. Her pulse quickened. Waiting for someone or something? She didn't regret calling the police. She had done what she was trained to do, and soon she would find out if she had been right. The atmosphere inside Brookfield Bank and Trust had changed. It wasn't obvious at first. Transactions still took place, the printers still hummed, and customers still shuffled between the teller lines and waiting area. But something felt off, a subtle shift like the hush that comes before a storm. Sarah Whitman could feel it. She tried to focus on her screen, but the numbers blurred together. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, unmoving. She stole another glance at the man in the hoodie. He was still sitting there, calm, scrolling on his phone as if nothing in the world could disturb him. For a brief second, she wondered if she had overreacted. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the blue and red lights flash outside. And just like that, everything changed. The two squad cars pulled up directly in front of the bank, their lights flashing but sirens off. A visible ripple moved through the room as people registered the presence of law enforcement. Customers glanced around uneasily, some stepping slightly away from the counters, others instinctively lowering their voices. Sarah watched as two uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered white man, likely in his late 40s, moving with the practiced authority of someone who had seen it all. His name tag read Officer Reynolds. The second was a younger black officer, fresh-faced but composed, with a keen awareness in his eyes that suggested he had been through more than his years implied. His tag read Officer Marshall. The two officers approached the entrance, hands resting near but not on their belts. Sarah exhaled. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? As the officers stepped inside, the weight of their presence settled over the room. The steady murmur of conversations dipped a fraction quieter. A woman at the ATM faltered mid-transaction, glancing over her shoulder. At the teller stations, Michael and Anna stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between the police and Sarah. The older white couple near the entrance, the same couple Sarah had earlier noticed tightening their grip on their belongings, stiffened. The woman clutched her purse even tighter as if expecting the worst. And then there was Eric, standing a few feet away, staring at Sarah with an expression that was impossible to read. She ignored his gaze. This was standard protocol. It was just precaution. Officer Reynolds reached the counter first, his deep voice steady but low. "You called about a suspicious person," Sarah nodded, clearing her throat. "Yes, he's been sitting there for nearly 30 minutes without approaching the counter or speaking to anyone. I just want to be cautious." The younger officer, Marshall, furrowed his brow slightly. "That's it?" he asked. Sarah felt a pang of irritation at his tone, as if he were questioning her judgment. "I know it doesn't sound like much, but we've had warnings about bank fraud cases involving loiterers. He could be waiting for a distraction, watching teller movements." Officer Reynolds gave a curt nod. "We'll check it out." And with that, they turned and walked toward the man in the hoodie. From where she stood, Sarah had a clear view of the interaction. The man, oblivious at first, continued scrolling through his phone until he sensed the officers standing before him. He looked up, blinking once. "Sir, can we talk to you for a second?" Officer Reynolds asked, his tone firm but not aggressive. The man's expression didn't change. He exhaled slowly, then put his phone away. "What's this about?" Officer Reynolds shifted slightly. "We got a call. You've been here for a while. Mind showing us some ID?" A heavy pause. Sarah could hear the blood rushing in her ears. The man's jaw tightened just slightly, but his hands remained calm and steady as he reached into his pocket. The tension in the bank thickened. He pulled out a leather wallet, flipped it open, and handed the officer a driver's license. Sarah could see Officer Reynolds' brow furrow. Then the younger officer leaned in for a look. A second later, his entire posture shifted. His eyes widened slightly. Sarah noticed it immediately. Something was wrong. The silence stretched a beat too long. Sarah's stomach twisted. Then Officer Reynolds cleared his throat, his grip on the ID stiff, awkward. He looked at the man differently now. "Mr. Carter." His voice had changed, less firm, more careful. Sarah froze. She knew that name. Eric's hands hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. The security guard near the entrance straightened. The older white couple at the counter turned their heads sharply. Even the tellers stopped typing. The man leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That's right." Sarah's pulse pounded. Her breath hitched. "Mr. Carter, as in Jonathan Carter, as in the owner of Brookfield Bank and Trust." The weight of her mistake crashed down on her. Officer Reynolds handed the ID back, stiff and uneasy. Officer Marshall took half a step back, as if he had suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. "Sir, we apologize for the misunderstanding." Jonathan Carter studied them both, his gaze unreadable. Then his eyes moved past them, directly to Sarah. She felt like she had been punched in the gut. A heavy silence settled over the entire bank. For the first time all day, no one moved. The usual rhythm of banking had come to a complete stop. Sarah's face burned. Her fingers gripped the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jonathan Carter tilted his head slightly. "Tell me," he said, his voice smooth but sharp, like a blade slipping between ribs. "At what point did I become a problem?" Sarah couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way she had expected. but his eyes told her everything. Sarah had called the cops on her own boss, and there was no taking it back. The security guard exhaled sharply, as if realizing he had been holding his breath. The older couple looked embarrassed, their earlier wariness now shamefully exposed. At the teller desk, Michael swallowed hard, staring at Sarah like he was witnessing a slow-motion disaster. Eric was still looking at her, but now his expression was pitying. She had wanted to do the right thing. She had trusted her instincts, but her instincts had just ruined her. Outside, the police cars turned off their lights. Sarah knew that was the least of her worries, because the real fallout was just beginning. For the first time in her career, Sarah Whitman didn't know what to say. The air inside Brookfield Bank and Trust had turned stiflingly thick, as if someone had sucked all the oxygen from the room. The usual background noise of printers, conversations, and clicking keyboards had vanished. It was silent, too silent. The two officers, Reynolds and Marshall, had stiffened at the realization of their mistake. Jonathan Carter, the man they had approached as a potential suspect, the man they had just asked for identification, the man they had nearly escorted out of his own bank, owned this place, owned all of it. And now every single person inside the bank knew it. Sarah felt frozen in place. Her mind screamed at her to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Jonathan Carter, Mr. Carter, didn't move. He remained seated, his posture relaxed, his fingers lightly tapping on the armrest of his chair. But there was a weight to the way he sat, the weight of authority, and his eyes, locked onto Sarah's, were sharp. "You own this bank." Officer Reynolds finally spoke, his voice quieter now, his stance noticeably different. "That's right," Jonathan replied, his tone measured, even. Officer Marshall cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. His previous composure was now cracking. "Sir, we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." Jonathan lifted a hand slightly, cutting him off. "No need to explain," he said simply, but it didn't sound forgiving. He turned his gaze back to Sarah. "I'm more interested in hearing from her." A sick, sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, Sarah," he said, voice calm but carrying an edge so sharp it could cut through steel. "At what point did I become a problem?" Sarah's lips parted, but no words came out. Her throat tightened. Everyone was watching. The customers, the tellers, Eric standing behind her, the security guard by the door. They were all waiting for her answer. She forced herself to swallow, her pulse hammering. I didn't recognize you," she stammered, her voice thinner than she intended. Jonathan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's your answer?" Sarah's stomach twisted. "You were sitting there for a long time," she pressed on, trying to justify herself. "You didn't come to the counter." "I wasn't sure what you were doing." Jonathan nodded slowly, as if processing her response. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Let me help you out," he said, his voice soft, yet commanding. "You saw a black man in a hoodie, sitting in a place you didn't think he belonged, and instead of asking if I needed help, instead of treating me like any other customer, you called the police." Sarah flinched. Her chest felt tight, her hands cold, because it wasn't just what he said. It was that he was right. No one spoke. Not a single voice rose to defend her, not even Eric. Michael, the teller, stared at his computer screen, his jaw tight. Anna, standing next to him, blinked rapidly, looking anywhere but at Sarah. The older couple, who had initially reacted nervously to Jonathan's presence, now seemed deeply uncomfortable, their postures stiff. And the black woman waiting in line near the counter. She was shaking her head. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. Officer Reynolds exhaled through his nose. His jaw moved slightly, as if he were grinding his teeth. Officer Marshall cleared his throat again. "Mr. Carter, again, we apologize." Jonathan held up a hand once more. "I appreciate your response, officer, but you're dismissed." Officer Reynolds blinked. "Sir, I don't need an explanation, I need you to leave." For a moment it looked like the older officer might protest, But then he caught Jonathan's expression, his mouth pressed into a tight line. Understood. Both officers nodded stiffly before turning toward the exit. The bank doors hissed open, then shut. They were gone, but the damage had already been done. Jonathan Carter was still looking at Sarah. His expression was unreadable, but the silence between them said everything. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Mr. Carter, You should be asking yourself something, Sarah." She swallowed. Her throat was too dry. "You should be asking yourself why I had to prove I belonged here." The words hit her like a hammer to the chest, because there was no good answer. She had assumed. She had seen what she wanted to see, and now she had to live with the consequences. The usual murmur of the bank slowly started to return, but it wasn't the same. People resumed their transactions. Customers whispered in hushed tones. The tellers went back to their work, but with lingering glances toward Sarah. And then there was the worst part. The black woman who had been waiting in line earlier finally stepped up to Sarah's window. She didn't speak immediately. She just slid a deposit slip across the counter. Her eyes met Sarah's, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "You should be ashamed." Sarah's breath hitched. She processed the transaction in silence, her face burning. But that wasn't the worst part. The whispers were. A group of young professionals standing near the business accounts desk glanced her way, muttering. A man at the loan officer's desk murmured something to the person next to him, shaking his head. Sarah's hands curled into fists at her sides. They all knew, and there was no taking it back. The front doors opened again. A woman in a navy blue suit walked in with swift, purposeful strides. Sarah's heart dropped. It was Amanda Rivers, regional executive, the woman who could fire someone with a smile. Amanda didn't even glance at Sarah. She went straight to Eric. "Where's Mr. Carter?" Eric straightened. "In his office, ma'am." Amanda nodded, didn't even look in Sarah's direction. She walked past the counter and toward the back offices. Sarah's stomach twisted. This was bad, really bad. Eric, who had been silent until now, finally spoke under his breath. "I told you this wasn't necessary." Sarah's head snapped toward him. He wasn't even looking at her anymore, just counting bills. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You saw him sitting there, minding his business. You called the cops anyway." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, to explain, to defend herself. But the words wouldn't come, because she knew. Deep down she knew, and so did everyone else. The air inside Brookfield Bank and Trust felt different now. Even though the police had left, even though the usual hum of transactions had resumed, something in the room had shifted. Sarah Whitman could feel it. It wasn't just in the way customers stole quick, assessing glances at her. It wasn't just in the quiet disappointment on the face of the black woman who had told her, "You should be ashamed." It wasn't even in Eric's refusal to look at her. It was everywhere, like an invisible weight pressing down on her, making it suddenly impossible to focus. For 15 years she had been the respected manager of this branch. Now she was the woman who called the cops on her own boss, and no one was going to forget it. Sarah sat at her desk, her hands still trembling slightly. She had always prided herself on professionalism, on being fair, on being someone who could be trusted. But in one single decision, that reputation had shattered. Her gut had been wrong. She had been so sure she was making the right call. And now she had to live with the reality of what she had done. She tried to focus, tried to drown herself in work, to pretend like the past hour hadn't just happened. But it was impossible. Everywhere she turned, she could feel the eyes on her. A customer at the business accounts desk whispered something to his colleague, throwing a glance her way. One of the tellers, Michael, hesitated before speaking to her, as if not sure how to act now. Even the security guard, Tom, kept his eyes lowered, suddenly less comfortable than he had ever been before. The bank was still functioning, but it wasn't the same. Not anymore. Sarah's fingers were still hovering over her keyboard when the glass door at the back of the bank swung open. Her stomach clenched. Jonathan Carter was leaving his office, and he wasn't alone. Walking beside him with swift, deliberate steps was Amanda Rivers, regional executive. Sarah had been dreading this moment since the second Amanda walked through the front doors. Jonathan didn't even glance in her direction. But Amanda did, and that look was enough. Amanda wasn't someone who raised her voice or showed anger outright. She didn't have to. She could deliver a devastating decision with a single sentence and a polite smile, and right now, she looked ready to do exactly that. Amanda walked straight to the teller stations first. She exchanged a few quick words with Eric, then with Michael and Anna. Then, finally, with the security guard, Tom. Sarah didn't know exactly what was being said, but she didn't have to. Amanda was gathering information, assessing, and every quiet conversation was just another nail in Sarah's coffin. When Amanda finally turned back, her gaze landed on Sarah. The entire bank was watching. "Sarah," Amanda said smoothly, "in my office." "Now." Sarah forced herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady. Her palms were sweating. This was it. She followed Amanda through the glass doors, her heart pounding. Behind her, she could feel the gaze of every single employee, every single customer. And worst of all, Jonathan Carter didn't even look back. The door shut behind them. Amanda didn't sit. She simply crossed her arms and stared. And for the second time that day, Sarah felt completely exposed. "What were you thinking?" Amanda asked. Her tone was calm, but not gentle. Sarah's throat was dry. She hesitated. "I was trying to be cautious." Amanda's eyebrows lifted. "Cautious," she repeated. "You called the police on your own boss, Sarah. You didn't recognize him." Sarah flushed deeply. "I'd never met him before in person." "That," Amanda cut her off, "is not an excuse." Amanda exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "Let me ask you something," she said. "If Jonathan Carter had been a white man in a suit, sitting in that waiting area, would you have made the same call?" Sarah felt her stomach drop. I don't know." "Yes, you do," Amanda said simply. And the worst part, she was right. Sarah had seen plenty of customers sit in that waiting area before. Some of them loitered longer than Jonathan had. But she had never felt the need to call the police on any of them. The realization hit her like a brick wall. She had done this, and there was no taking it back. Amanda took a slow breath. "Sarah, you've worked here for 15 years. You've always been thorough, always followed procedure." A pause. "But today you made a choice that has put this bank and yourself in a very bad position." Sarah's pulse quickened. Are you firing me?" she forced out. Amanda was silent for a moment, then she shook her head. "Not today," a beat, "but I am putting you on unpaid leave." Sarah felt her knees go weak. Amanda, please, You need to take some time," Amanda interrupted, "to think about what happened. Because I can tell you right now, Jonathan Carter will be thinking about whether or not you still deserve to work here." Sarah's heart plummeted. That's all. Sarah couldn't move. For the past hour she had been drowning in shame. Now she was officially sinking. She barely remembered leaving the office. Barely remembered walking past the tellers, past the customers, past the judgment she could still feel in the air. Her shift wasn't even over. But she couldn't stay. She needed to leave. Now. As she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. She walked to her car on autopilot, hands shaking as she reached for her keys. She climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was suspended. Unpaid. No guarantee she would ever step foot inside that bank as an employee again. And the worst part, for the first time in her life she had to sit with the truth of who she was, because she had never thought of herself as racist. She had never thought she was the type of person who would do something like this. But now, Now she wasn't so sure. Her breath hitched. She picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then finally she typed, "Unconscious bias in the workplace." Articles, studies, stories. For the first time she clicked on one, because maybe, just maybe, it was time to learn. The drive home was a blur. Sarah barely remembered pulling out of the parking lot of Brookfield Bank and Trust, barely registered the familiar streets she had driven down 1,000 times. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but her mind was somewhere else, stuck replaying everything that had happened that day. The police arriving, the way Jonathan Carter had looked at her, the way the entire bank had gone silent, the disappointment in Amanda's voice, and the words that had hit her the hardest, "You should be ashamed." The words had come from a black woman she had never met before, but they had cut deeper than anything else, because the truth was, she was ashamed. She pulled into her driveway, turned off the car, and just sat there. Her house was dark, the only light coming from the glow of the street lamp outside. It had never felt so quiet before. She wasn't ready to go inside, wasn't ready to face her own thoughts. For 15 years, she had walked into that bank with confidence. She had prided herself on being a good manager, a fair person. But today had shattered that image completely. Now she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Her phone buzzed. For a second, she thought about ignoring it, but when she glanced down at the screen, her stomach twisted. It was a group chat notification, one that included some of her coworkers from the bank. She opened it. There were only 3 new messages, but it was enough. Michael, yikes, that was painful to watch. Anna, I still can't believe she actually called the cops on him. Eric, unreal. She really thought she was doing the right thing, too. Her face burned. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen. They were talking about her, and not just in passing. They were mocking her, judging her. Like she was one of those people, the kind of person she had always believed she wasn't. She closed the app without responding, but the damage had been done. Sarah finally forced herself to step out of the car. She unlocked the front door, walked inside, and let the quiet wrap around her. For the first time, she had nowhere to hide, no work to distract her, no customers to deal with, no coworkers to talk to. It was just her. And the ugly truth she had been avoiding. She had made a terrible mistake, and deep down she knew why. She had seen Jonathan Carter sitting there, and she had assumed. Had it been a white man in a suit, she wouldn't have thought twice. But a black man in a hoodie. Her first instinct had been fear, not curiosity, not customer service, not basic human decency, just suspicion. And because of that, she had humiliated herself in front of an entire room of people. Worse, she had humiliated him. Sarah walked into her kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hands still shaking. And then, out of nowhere, a memory surfaced. She was 16 years old. It was her first summer job, working as a cashier at a small grocery store. Her manager, a gruff, middle-aged man named Ron, had pulled her aside after just a few weeks. "Listen, kid," he had said, leaning against the counter. "There are certain customers you gotta keep an eye on." She had been eager to learn. "What do you mean?" she had asked. Ron had gestured toward the aisles. "You see a group of teenagers hanging around near the candy section too long, keep watch. You see a guy with his hands in his pockets looking nervous, keep watch." Then he had lowered his voice slightly. "And if you see a black guy walking around without a cart, just kinda looking around, keep extra watch." 16-year-old Sarah had just nodded. She hadn't even questioned it. She had just absorbed it. And now, years later, she had acted on it without even realizing it. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and stared at the blank search bar. For the past 15 years, she had told herself she wasn't racist. She had never used slurs. She had never treated black customers differently. At least, she had believed that. She had never thought she was the type of person who would make assumptions, and yet here she was. She hesitated for a long moment. Then finally, she typed, "Unconscious bias in the workplace." The screen filled with articles, studies, real-life examples. She clicked on the first link. The article wasn't comforting. It described how bias isn't always loud and obvious. It's not just the people who say hateful things, or the ones who refuse to hire minorities, or the ones who blatantly discriminate. Sometimes, it's the small, quiet moments. The instinct to watch a black man in a hoodie longer than a white man in a suit. The assumption that someone doesn't belong before they've even spoken. The immediate leap to suspicion instead of understanding. Sarah read every word, and with each paragraph she felt a little sicker. This wasn't just some abstract issue. This was her. She knew she had to face Jonathan Carter again, and she had no idea what she could possibly say. "I'm sorry, it wasn't enough. I didn't mean to." That didn't change what had happened. The truth was, nothing she said could erase what she had done. But maybe she could at least learn from it. Maybe she could start to change. She wasn't sure if Jonathan would ever forgive her. But she was starting to realize this wasn't about whether he forgave her. This was about whether she was willing to finally see the truth. And for the first time she was. Sarah Whitman had never felt this lost before. For 15 years she had built her identity around being a professional, a leader, a woman who made smart, calculated decisions. She had believed herself to be fair, reasonable, a person who judged by actions, not appearances. But today had shattered that illusion. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. The words she had typed into the search bar still blinked at her. Unconscious bias in the workplace. She had never thought to look this up before, never thought it applied to her. But now she wasn't so sure. She hesitated before clicking the first article. The title was sharp. Racial bias in everyday decisions, how we assume without realizing. It felt personal, too personal. She almost closed the tab, almost convinced herself that she had already learned enough today. But deep down, she knew the real reason she wanted to close it, because she was afraid of what she might find. She forced herself to read. The article wasn't gentle. It laid out the facts, cold, undeniable facts. People aren't born biased. They learn it from the world around them. Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's instinctual hesitation. Sometimes it's feeling uncomfortable without knowing why. Sometimes it's calling the police on a black man who was doing nothing wrong. Sarah gripped the edge of the table. She had spent the entire drive home telling herself she wasn't racist, but maybe that wasn't the right question. Maybe the question wasn't, "Am I racist?" Maybe the question was, "How have I been shaped by the world I grew up in?" And that was a question she had never wanted to ask, because if she asked it, she'd have to face the answer, and the answer wasn't pretty. A memory surfaced. She was 8 years old, walking through a department store with her mother. She had seen a black woman and her son looking at winter coats. Sarah hadn't thought twice about it, but then her mother's hand had tightened on her wrist. "Stay close," she had whispered. Sarah had asked why. Her mother never answered, and at 8 years old she hadn't thought much about it. She had just absorbed it. Like a seed planted in her mind, growing slowly over the years, Sarah rubbed her temples. That wasn't the only memory. She thought back to her teenage job at the grocery store, when her manager had told her to keep an eye on certain customers. She thought about the college professor who had joked about how inner-city students were always late. She thought about all the times she had crossed the street without realizing why. How many times had she made a decision based on instinct, never questioning where that instinct came from? She had spent years priding herself on being a good person. But today, Jonathan Carter had looked her in the eyes and asked her the question she had no good answer for. At what point did I become a problem? And now she knew. He had been a problem the second she saw him, not because of who he was, but because of who she was, and that realization felt like drowning. Her fingers hovered over her phone. She thought about calling Jonathan, apologizing, explaining, but what would she say? I didn't mean it. That didn't erase what she had done. I wasn't thinking. That didn't make it better. She imagined his voice on the other end of the line, calm, measured, and she imagined him saying the one thing that made her stomach turn to knots. You're only sorry because you got caught. And maybe he would be right. Even if Jonathan Carter never spoke to her again, there were other people who would remember. Eric, who had watched it all happen. Michael and Anna, who had whispered about it after she left. The customers, who had seen her call the police on a man who owned the very bank she worked at. Amanda, who had looked at her like she was already gone. Sarah had never felt invisible at work before. But tomorrow, if she even had a job to go back to, she knew what was waiting for her. The whispers, the side glances, the unspoken "that's her." She had spent 15 years building her reputation, and she had destroyed it in a single afternoon. She stared at the blank email draft on her screen. She had typed 2 words, "I'm sorry," and nothing else. She couldn't bring herself to hit send, because she knew what Jonathan Carter would see. He would see a woman trying to fix her own guilt, not a woman who truly understood. And the worst part, he would be right. Sarah closed her laptop. She couldn't erase what she had done. She couldn't make people forget. But maybe, just maybe, she could start learning. And maybe someday she could be better than the person she had been today. She wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was the only thing she had left.